Hi everyone, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm really happy you're here. Tonight, we're going to go on a calm and quiet trip to learn something amazing. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and let's enjoy this peaceful science story together. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? If you like relaxing science videos, don't forget to tap the like button. Now let's begin. Beneath the endless seas of an ancient Earth, long before trees carved green shadows into the sky, or flowers dressed the land in petals, the soil was bare rock, weathered and fractured by wind, water and time. Yet in those cracks, something quiet began to stir. The first fungus was not a mushroom in the way we know them now, not a familiar umbrella on the forest floor, but a delicate network of filaments so fine they could slip between grains of stone. They were threads of life weaving through the dark, tasting minerals, sensing moisture, reaching always outward. Imagine a world without roots, without leaves, without the hum of insects or the trill of birds. A place where the only voices belong to rain, to rivers carving channels, and to the slow, patient work of life so small it could pass unnoticed for ages. The earliest fungi lived in partnership with that silence. They were scavengers and alchemists, breaking down the stubborn faces of rock, turning them into something soft, something that could cradle other lives yet to come. They carried no seeds, only spores, tiny grains of possibility drifting on the faintest breeze or in the ripple of shallow waters. When those spores landed, they woke as threads, exploring their new home in every direction at once, seeking nourishment in places where none seemed to exist. In that distant time, the continents themselves were young. Volcanoes spat ash into the air, and rain washed minerals into the sea. The oceans, rich with microbial life, lapped against stony shores where nothing yet cast shade. But even there, life wanted to spread, to climb from water to land. Fungi were among the first to make that slow crossing. They did not march boldly, they crept, sending their whisper-thin hyphae into every surface they could reach, feeling their way like blind explorers. They broke down what they touched, releasing locked-away elements into forms other living things could use. Without eyes, without leaves, without even a sense of direction, they transformed the land grain by grain. It is strange to think that such quiet labour could change the fate of the planet, yet that is what the first fungi did. By dismantling stone and mixing it with the faint traces of life, they began to create soil, the stage upon which forests, grasslands and all land ecosystems would later grow. Their bodies were so unlike ours that even today we struggle to imagine them as individuals. A single fungus could stretch for meters, its filaments winding through the earth unseen, each cell passing signals and nutrients in a language older than speech. They were not plants, for they had no chlorophyll to drink in sunlight. They were not animals, for they could not move to hunt. Instead, they dissolved their food outside their bodies, sending enzymes into their surroundings and drawing in what they needed. They were patient in a way that only something tied to the earth can be, and yet they were restless too, always seeking, always reaching for the next fragment of stone, the next pocket of decaying matter, the next damp crevice where life might take root. Some scientists believe that fungi, even in those earliest days, formed partnerships with simple plants or algae, trading minerals for sugars in a collaboration that would one day give rise to lichens. If this is true, then the first fungus was not only a builder of worlds, but also a maker of alliances, forging connections that would shape the course of evolution. Over millions of years, the descendants of those first fungi spread across the land, adapting to every corner of the earth. They grew in shallow soils, clung to cliffs, and wandered through the spaces between sand grains. They became recyclers of all that lived and died, ensuring that nothing in nature was ever truly wasted. In a world where death was constant, fungi made it possible for life to begin again. But in those earliest days, their world was still one of extremes: fierce storms, sudden droughts, and a sun that beat down without mercy. It was in the shelter of shadows, under stones and inside cracks, that they found refuge. There, they perfected their craft of turning what was hard into what could sustain life. They worked in cycles too slow for any creature to notice, yet their results were written into the very ground. Long before any roots split the soil, before any flower unfurled, the invisible hands of fungi were already shaping the land, making it ready for everything that would come after. You can almost picture it now, a rocky shore on a young earth, the tide pulling back to reveal glistening stones. On their surfaces, no green carpets of moss yet grow, no blooms brighten the scene, but look closer and you might see a faint fuzz of life clinging there, thin as breath, pale against the rock. This is the beginning. It is not loud, not grand, not the sort of moment that would seem worth remembering if you were standing there. And yet, from this quiet work would rise the rich soils of the future, the forests that breathe for us, the fields that feed us, and the endless chains of life that connect us to a world billions of years older than we are. The first fungus was not a thing of beauty by our eyes, but it was a thing of grace, moving in slow conversation with the stone, speaking in the patient language of time itself. If you close your eyes and let your mind wander back across hundreds of millions of years, you might find yourself in a landscape where life is still learning the rules of land. There is no hum of insects, no rustle of leaves, only the slow breath of wind and the distant crash of waves against untouched shores. Here the first fungi continue their quiet work, threading themselves through cracks in rock and pockets of sand, weaving an invisible map of the land beneath your feet. These filaments, called hyphae, were explorers in the purest sense, not bound by sight or sound, but guided by the faint chemical whispers of their surroundings. Each filament extended toward the promise of nourishment, splitting and branching endlessly until it formed a vast network called mycelium, a living web beneath the surface linking every fragment of the world it touched. Even in those ancient days, this hidden kingdom moved with a purpose, searching not for conquest but for connection. The air above them was harsh, unfiltered by forests or clouds heavy with organic life. Ultraviolet light fell without mercy, and rains came and went in unpredictable torrents. But fungi had no need for sunlit leaves or deep roots. Their strength was in the places light could not reach. In darkness and dampness, they excelled, building their bodies from the remnants of what had once lived and the stubborn mineral faces of stone. Some scientists think that these early fungi may have partnered with cyanobacteria or algae, creating the first lichens, an alliance that could draw energy from the sun while still taking nourishment from the land. In this way, fungi became early bridge builders between two worlds, the wet abundance of the oceans and the dry, unclaimed vastness of the continents. These lichen partnerships could cling to bare rock, dissolving it grain by grain, leaving behind the first thin layers of soil. Without this patient groundwork, plants might never have taken root on land. In the ocean, life was already rich and varied, but on land, every step forward was a struggle. The fungi did not move quickly, but time was on their side. Their mycelial webs could survive seasons of drought, waiting dormant until the return of moisture woke them again. When rain fell, they surged into action, extending further, releasing enzymes that unlock the minerals within their world. They were quiet chemists, reshaping the land in ways invisible to the eye, yet essential for all that would follow. Even in death, fungi fed fungi, their own decaying threads becoming nourishment for others. It was a cycle as old as their first breath, life returning to life, endlessly recycled through the web they spun. In this slow, persistent way, fungi prepared the stage for the next great chapter of Earth's story. As the eons passed, other life forms began to emerge from the water. The first simple plants, fragile and green, seeking to catch sunlight on their tiny fronds. But sunlight alone could not sustain them. They needed minerals, nutrients, a foothold in the land. It is here that fungi became their silent allies. Mycelium twined itself around plant roots in a partnership so ancient and so vital that even today most plants cannot live without it. The fungi gave minerals in exchange for sugars, their fine threads extending a plant's reach far beyond what roots alone could manage. This was not charity, but a balanced trade, one that allowed both to thrive. In the earliest forests, which were more like low, sprawling mats of green than towering trees, this relationship flourished. The invisible networks beneath the soil grew in complexity, connecting plant to plant, stone to leaf, earth to sky. It was as though the land itself was learning to speak through these connections, sharing its resources in a language of chemistry and flow. And still, the first fungi and their descendants did not seek to dominate, but to endure. They spread into every environment that could offer them the faintest moisture and a scrap of organic matter. They crept into deserts and alpine heights, into volcanic slopes and the shadows of cliffs. They lived where no other life could, transforming the inhospitable into something capable of holding more. Every spore they released was a message to the future, a chance to find a new home, to continue the endless work of transformation. The wind carried them, the rain washed them, and sometimes tiny insects in later ages would bear them without knowing. Yet in these earliest times, before wings and carapaces had joined the world, it was the air, the water, and the earth itself that were their messengers. The shape of the planet we know now owes much to these hidden workers. Without fungi to prepare the ground, plants might never have flourished, animals might never have followed, and the green richness of earth might have remained only in the seas. The first fungus was not grand, not beautiful in the way we think of beauty, yet it was one of the most influential forms life ever took. It did not roar into existence with force or light. It simply wove itself into the bones of the planet, one filament at a time. Over time, the work of those filaments would lay the foundation for forests that breathe, soils that feed, and ecosystems that hum with life. In the quiet spaces beneath our feet, in the damp earth after rain, you can still sense their presence, the descendants of that first fungus, still doing the same patient work that shaped the world long before we arrived. The story of the first fungus does not end with its quiet conquest of stone and soil. It stretches forward through time, threading itself into every chapter of life on land. Once plants had found their footing, drawn upward by the sun and sustained by fungal partnerships below, the landscape began to change. Shadows appeared where none had been, as stems and fronds cast their outlines across the ground. This was not only the birth of forests, but the creation of new worlds for fungi to inhabit. Dead leaves and stems became a feast, fallen trunks a banquet that could last for years. Fungi stepped into the role of nature's great recycler, breaking down what plants could not take back, releasing locked nutrients to be used again. Without this ceaseless work, the land would have drowned in its own debris and the flow of life would have stalled. Instead, the fungi ensured that nothing ever truly ended, that every ending was a beginning in disguise. As plants grew taller and animals began to roam the land, fungi adapted alongside them. Some became decomposers, turning the fallen into food for the living. Others became parasites, drawing life directly from their hosts. Still others deepened their ancient alliances, wrapping themselves around roots in intricate exchanges of food and minerals. It is here, in this widening web of interactions, that the descendants of the first fungus began to influence not just the shape of the land, but the course of evolution itself. A plant better partnered with fungi could grow stronger, spread further, and survive harsher conditions than one without. A patch of earth rich in fungal networks could host more life than barren ground. The balance of survival tilted quietly in favour of those who joined the underground conversation. If you could walk through one of those early forests and peel back the skin of soil beneath your feet, you would find something extraordinary. A white branching web stretching in every direction, linking roots to rocks, rocks to roots, roots to roots, an invisible map of connection. Signals pass along these threads, chemical messages warning of drought or pest, sharing resources between distant plants, even allowing older, larger plants to nourish seedlings far away. Though invisible to the eye, this was as real as any river or mountain. A living network built on the same principles as the first fungus that explored the bare rocks eons before. That ancient architecture had simply expanded, weaving itself into more lives, more places, more stories than could be counted. And yet, even in this age of abundance, fungi remained humble in their form. Most of their work happened underground, unseen and uncelebrated. Only when the time came to reproduce did they show themselves. Small bursts of fruiting bodies pushing above the surface, scattering spores into the wind. To us, these might look like mushrooms, cups or spindles, but to the fungus, they were simply vessels for the next generation, the latest expression of a strategy older than forests themselves. Each spore carried the memory of its lineage, the lessons written in the chemistry of survival, how to find food in stone, how to wait through drought, how to form alliances, and how to build a home in a world that had once been empty. In the endless stretch of time, climates shifted, continents drifted, and species rose and fell. Through all of it, fungi endured. Their resilience came not from strength or speed, but from adaptability, from the ability to live almost anywhere there was life to connect with or death to recycle. They became part of the deep cycles that keep the planet balanced, their work so constant and quiet that it is easier to forget it exists. But the truth is, without them, life on land would unravel. So much depends on what happens in the shadows, beneath the soil, in the dark spaces between grains of sand. The first fungus began this work long before the first leaf reached for the sun, and its descendants have never stopped. Even today, when we walk through a forest, when we see fields rich with crops, or when we marvel at the resilience of a wildflower blooming from a crack in the pavement, we are looking at the legacy of that first fungus. It is there in the soil that cradles the roots, in the unseen networks that feed and protect, in the endless renewal of what has fallen into something that can rise again. It is a reminder that the most profound changes often begin in silence, in places no one is watching, and that the smallest threads can hold the weight of the world. If you pause and imagine the earth without fungi, no forests, no fertile soil, no recycling of life, you can feel the magnitude of their gift, and somewhere deep beneath your feet, the descendants of that first filament are still at work, just as they were hundreds of millions of years ago, shaping the land in ways we may never fully see but will always depend on. They are the quiet architects of the living world, and their story is, in many ways, the story of life itself. In the dim corridors of Earth's early history, long before flowers painted the land or the rustle of leaves stirred the air, there were forests that were not made of trees. These were ancient realms of towering fungi, their trunks rising like pillars of pale stone, some as tall as houses standing sentinel across damp primeval plains. Scientists call them proto-taxites, though the name feels too small for what they must have been. Imagine walking beneath their silent watch, the ground soft with moss-like growths, the air heavy with the smell of decay and rain-soaked earth. These giants were not plants, nor were they animals. They belonged to the hidden kingdom, built not from wood or bone, but from countless threads woven together into vast living columns. In an age when the tallest green plants barely reached your knees, these fungal towers claimed the sky, their surfaces pocked with tiny openings that released invisible clouds of spores into the wind. Each spore carried a memory, a coded whisper from a life form that had already been on the land for hundreds of millions of years. The world around them was strange and still becoming itself. Rivers wandered across the land in wide, braided channels. The sun burned unfiltered through a sky where the ozone layer was still forming, and the seasons were not yet the steady rhythm we know today. Rain came in fits and bursts, sometimes drenching the land for weeks, sometimes withholding water for long stretches. In this unpredictable theatre, fungi thrived where others struggled. They were not bound by the need for sunlight, for they did not eat light. They ate the remains of what had been, breaking it down into the building blocks for what could be. These great fungal towers drew their nourishment from the earth, from decaying matter, and perhaps from unseen partnerships with smaller life forms, algae, bacteria, or even the first primitive plants. In their tissues, water could be stored, nutrients could be ferried, and life could persist even when the land around them cracked and dried. To imagine their lives is to slow your thinking to the pace of centuries. The proto-taxites did not rush. Their growth was steady, patient, imperceptible to anything but time itself. A spore landing in a patch of damp soil might weave its way outward for years before thickening into the column that would one day rise above the landscape. As it grew, it layered itself with dense mats of hyphae, each one a thread in the great fabric of its body. These threads were alive with chemical activity, absorbing, transporting, transforming. Through them flowed the ancient conversations of life, minerals drawn from the earth, organic compounds dismantled and rebuilt, the quiet alchemy that turned decay into sustenance. Every part of the proto-taxites was both itself and part of a greater network beneath the ground, connected to other fungi, other life forms, in a mesh that reached further than the eye could ever follow. What must it have been like to live in their shadow? The land would have been a patchwork of wet lowlands and rocky rises, dotted with mats of early plants, scattered pools and carpets of mosses. Insects had not yet claimed the skies in great numbers, and vertebrates were only beginning to test the waters of the shore. It was a quiet, slow-moving world where change came not in the flutter of wings or the snapping of twigs, but in the gradual rearrangement of the living fabric itself. In this stillness, the fungal towers would have been landmarks, places where moisture gathered, where nutrients seeped back into the soil, where smaller life could shelter from the harshness of the open land. Perhaps their presence shaped the paths of rivers, slowed the erosion of slopes, or gave the first plants the stability they needed to take hold. In a way, they were architects of habitability, carving niches in a land that was still learning how to sustain complexity. And always there were spores, each one invisible to the naked eye, each one a fragment of possibility carried on the breeze. Some would land on stone and fade, others would settle in a crack rich with moisture and food, waking into threads that began the whole slow process again. Over eons, this cycle repeated until the great towers themselves became part of the soil they had helped to create. In their fall, they fed the next generation, not with seeds or roots, but with the intricate memory of a body made from the patient weaving of life's smallest threads. And though the proto-taxities themselves would one day vanish from the world, replaced by forests of towering plants, their legacy, the very idea of life building itself high above the ground, would remain. The trees that came later would stand on a foundation laid by these silent ancient giants of the fungal realm. The age of the prototaxits was a chapter unlike any other in Earth's history, a time when the land was still a vast and unfinished canvas. The great fungal towers rose in scattered stands, sometimes alone like solitary watchmen, sometimes clustered together in quiet gatherings across the rolling mossy plains. From a distance they might have looked like stone columns weathered by centuries of rain, yet their surfaces were alive, faintly spongy, breathing in their slow, hidden way. Their height, reaching up to 8 meters, was not merely a display of size, but a testament to the strange freedom of that ancient world. Without the shade of tall plants to compete with, without grazing animals to strip them down, they could grow unchecked, pulling their resources from an underground web that reached far beyond the base of each column. Every prototaxites was not just an individual, but the visible tip of an invisible organism sprawling through the soil, feeding in silence. Beneath the ground, hyphae stretched outward like threads of lightless rivers, meeting others, fusing, sharing, and redistributing the wealth of minerals and organic fragments gathered from the land. This underground network was an unbroken conversation, a living circulation of resources that bound the planes together. Even in death, a fallen prototaxites did not cease to serve. Its body became a banquet for smaller fungi and primitive decomposers who returned its stored nutrients to the soil. In this way, nothing was wasted. Decay was not an ending here, but a passage, a necessary exchange that kept the fragile ecosystem turning. The towers stood as monuments to this principle, that life was not a race or a conquest, but a slow, enduring collaboration between all that lived and all that had lived before. In the moist air after rains, the scent around the fungal towers would have been rich and earthy, carrying the faint tang of organic matter breaking down. The ground nearby might have been softer, spongier, laced with the remains of older towers long returned to the soil. Spores, released from countless tiny openings high on the columns, drifted invisibly through the air, carried by currents to places they might never see. Some would land and wait, for days, for months, for years, until moisture and warmth conspired to wake them. Then, with the patience of their lineage, they would begin again, weaving the delicate first filaments into the surrounding earth, invisible yet unstoppable. This persistence was their greatest strength. In a world where climates shifted without warning and resources were scattered, fungi could pause their lives when conditions turned harsh, then resume as if no time had passed when the land welcomed them again. It is possible that the prototaxites did not live alone in their bodies. Some researchers believe that algae or cyanobacteria may have dwelt within their tissues, forming a relationship similar to lichens today. If so, then these towering fungi were not only decomposers, but also quiet harvesters of sunlight, blending the abilities of two vastly different life forms. This would have given them an even greater advantage, allowing them to feed both from the earth and from the light above. Whether this partnership truly existed or not, the idea itself hints at the adaptability and openness of fungi, their capacity to merge with other life in ways that create something entirely new. It is a trait still alive in their descendants, seen in the countless mutualistic relationships that bind fungi to plants, animals, and even bacteria in the modern world. Around the towers, early plant life began to evolve, pushing upward in slow increments. Small vascular plants began to emerge, creeping ferns and club mosses that could stretch above the mats of liverworts and mosses that had claimed much of the ground. These plants too often relied on fungi to survive, their roots mingling with the hyphae in the same intimate trade of minerals for sugars that persists to this day. In the presence of the prototaxites, these young plants may have found not only nourishment but shelter, benefiting from the moisture trapped in the shadow of the great columns. Over countless seasons, the world around them became greener, the land thickening with life that reached higher and higher. The fungal towers, once the only giants in a low world, began to share the skyline with plants that could harness the sun directly, and slowly the balance of height began to shift. But even as the first forests rose, the prototaxites endured. Their time was not ended by competition alone, for they occupied a role that plants could not easily replace. They thrived in places where soil was thin, where decay was slow, where minerals were locked away in stone. They continued their ancient work of transformation, turning the hard and lifeless into the soft and fertile, preparing the land for the generations that would follow. Their disappearance, when it came, was gradual, a fading from dominance rather than a sudden fall. As plants grew taller and animals grew more numerous, the great fungal towers became rarer, retreating to the margins until they left no living representatives at all. Yet in their passing, they had already given their gift, a world more hospitable, more complex, more ready for the unfolding story of life. Today, their memory survives in stone, in the fossilized remains of their dense, layered tissues, in the strange patterns that once pulsed with the chemistry of life, and in every patch of soil alive with fungi, in every mycelial thread that winds through a forest floor. There is an echo of them, the slow builders of the first high places on land. They remind us that the tallest forms of life need not be the fastest, and that even in a silent, patient existence, there can be a kind of grandeur that shapes the destiny of the world. When we try to imagine the final days of the proto-taxites, it is tempting to picture a sudden vanishing, but nature rarely writes endings so abruptly. Their decline unfolded slowly, like a shadow stretching across a plain as the sun sinks towards the horizon. The land was no longer the same place it had been when they first rose. Where once there had been open spaces and low carpets of mosses, now there were young forests casting dappled shade across the ground. Vascular plants with their leaves reaching toward the sky were drawing energy directly from sunlight, growing taller each generation. These newcomers thrived in the soils enriched by centuries of fungal labour, and with every season, they claimed more of the skyline that had once belonged to the fungal towers alone. In the shifting light beneath these plants, the spores of the proto-taxites still drifted, still landed, still woke into hyphae, but their towering forms became rarer, replaced by the dense green architecture of leaves and stems. The change was not simply a matter of being overshadowed. The ecosystems themselves were evolving. With more plant life came more herbivorous animals, followed by predators, and with them a quicker cycle of life and death. Nutrients moved faster, decaying matter was consumed more quickly, and the conditions that once favoured the slow, steady rise of fungal columns began to fade. Smaller fungi, nimble and quick to fruit, began to dominate, breaking down debris in days or weeks instead of decades. The grand towers, whose growth took years, could not compete with this speed in a world that no longer gave them the empty expanses and slow rhythms they had once known. Their strength had been in patience, but patience was no longer the winning strategy. Still, they did not vanish without leaving their mark. The soils beneath the first forests bore the imprint of their long presence, rich with the minerals they had drawn from stone, softened by the organic matter they had returned to the earth. The young trees that crowded upward were not starting from nothing. They were building upon the legacy of the proto-taxites. Even their decline likely fed the rising world, their immense bodies collapsing into the ground, nourishing the very plants that had risen to share and eventually replace their domain. In this way, they did not simply disappear, they became part of the living foundation of the ecosystem that followed. And though their physical form passed into memory, their nature lived on in the hidden networks of fungi that still weave beneath our feet. The same slow, patient growth, the same tireless breaking down of what is hard into what can sustain life, the same silent partnership with plants. All of it is a continuation of the work begun in the age of the proto-taxites. The vast mycelial webs in today's forests are smaller in stature, but no less grand in their purpose. They still connect trees to trees, still move nutrients across great distances, still make possible the abundance we see above ground. In a sense, the great towers never truly died. They simply changed their shape, retreating into the soil to continue their work in quieter ways. If you walk through a forest now and kneel to touch the ground, you might feel the faint resilience of the earth beneath your palm, the softness that comes from centuries of decay and renewal. That softness is the legacy of countless generations of fungi, stretching all the way back to those first monumental columns. Imagine, for a moment, the plains as they once were, dotted with pale giants standing in stillness, their spores drifting into a sky without birds, their roots entwined with a land still finding its identity. Imagine how the wind must have sounded weaving between them, how the rain must have drummed softly on their living skin. These are images we can only hold in our minds now, for the world they belong to is long gone. Yet perhaps their story is not just about the past. Perhaps it is a reminder of the value of the unseen, the unhurried, the enduring. The proto-Taxites shaped the land not by force or speed, but by simply persisting, by working with what was there, by building slowly and allowing time itself to be their ally. In our fast-moving age, there is something humbling in that. Beneath the soil, in the quiet spaces where roots and mycelium meet, the descendants of those giants are still whispering in the language of minerals and water, still shaping the world in ways we rarely notice. The columns may no longer stand, but the threads remain, holding together the memory of a time when the tallest forms of life were not trees, but towers of fungus, reaching patiently toward a sky they never hurried to touch. Long before flowers swayed in summer winds or forests whispered in green shadows, there was a meeting on the raw skin of the earth, not between animals or plants, but between two entirely different worlds of life. It was the union of fungi and algae, a partnership so improbable and so enduring that it would leave its mark on every continent. We know it now as lichen, but in those earliest days it was something entirely new, something that had never existed before. Picture a bare stretch of rock scoured by storms, baked by an unfiltered sun, with no soil, no shade, no shelter. Life in such a place was fleeting, clinging only where a drop of water lingered or a thread of nutrients seeped from the stone. And yet here, in the most unlikely of places, fungal filaments reached out and embraced tiny, sun-loving cells of algae or cyanobacteria. The fungus offered shelter, moisture, and a safe structure to live within. The algae offered food, made from sunlight and air. Together they became something greater than either could be alone. This was no loud beginning. There was no flash or roar to mark the birth of the first lichen. It happened quietly in the slow dance of trial and error that evolution knows so well. Some fungal threads brushed against algae drifting in water. Others met cyanobacteria nestled in damp crevices, and in rare moments, the fit was just right. The fungal hyphae wrapped around the photosynthetic cells, protecting them from the harshness outside, and in return those cells fed the fungus with sugars drawn from the sun. This exchange created a microcosm of stability, a tiny island of life able to endure where neither partner could have survived alone. In that union lay the seeds of an ecological revolution, for lichens could colonize rock, withstand drought, survive freezing, and patiently begin the slow work of creating soil. Imagine kneeling at the edge of a barren volcanic plain, the air sharp with the smell of cooled lava. All around the ground is black, jagged, and lifeless to the eye. But close your gaze to the surface and you might see a faint crust, a patch of pale green or dusty orange clinging tightly to the stone. These are the first lichens painting the rock in subtle colours, spreading slowly outward in circles so small they could be missed by anyone not looking closely. Each is a living collaboration, the fungus holding water like a sponge, the algae making food from the meagre sunlight, the two sharing resources in a bond without greed. Over years, perhaps decades, these patches expand, secreting acids that gently dissolve the rock beneath them. Grain by grain, they release minerals into a form that can nourish other life. When they die, their tiny bodies add a trace of organic matter to the surface, the first step towards soil. It was a transformation so slow that the world barely noticed, yet so steady that over millions of years it reshaped the land. Lichens spread across bare cliffs, high mountain slopes, polar deserts, and lava fields, anywhere too extreme for roots or leaves. They were the patient settlers, arriving long before forests, long before grass, long before any creature could graze the ground. In their own way, they were artists, each species painting the rock in different hues, yellow, grey, red, black, white, their pigments shielding them from intense sunlight or blending them into the stone. These colours were not for beauty but for survival, yet they gave the land a quiet vibrance, a sign that life had found a way into even the harshest places. The resilience of lichens came from the strengths of both partners. The fungus could endure long stretches without food, waiting for the algae to resume photosynthesis when light and moisture returned. The algae could live within the protective fungal walls, shielded from drying winds and temperature extremes. Together, they could survive where neither could last alone. Some lichens even carried cyanobacteria capable of fixing nitrogen from the air, adding another gift to the land, a way to enrich barren soils with one of life's most essential nutrients. In this way, they were not only colonizers of rock, but also the first gardeners, laying the groundwork for the plants that would follow. It is humbling to think that much of the fertile ground beneath our feet owes its beginnings to these tiny partnerships. Without lichens, the slow creation of soil might have taken far longer, delaying the rise of plants and by extension the animals that depend on them. Every forest, every meadow, every patch of farmland carries within it the legacy of those early alliances, and even now, when we see a patch of lichen on a stone wall or a boulder in a field, we are looking at the same quiet strategy that first conquered the land. A marriage of kingdoms, a blending of talents, a patient shaping of the earth, one grain at a time. As the ages unfolded, the partnership of fungus and algae proved to be one of the most enduring alliances in the history of life. The lichens, quiet and unassuming, spread far beyond the volcanic plains and rocky shores where they may have first arisen. They crept across high cliffs, colonized the frozen tundras, and even clung to the sheer faces of mountains where snowstorms swept for most of the year. In each place they carried with them the same unhurried rhythm, growing a few millimeters a year, sometimes less, yet persisting for decades or centuries. In their slow expansion, they became the architects of transformation, taking the raw mineral bones of the earth and weaving them together with the delicate threads of life. Every patch of lichen was a small but determined step in the long march towards soil, toward a world where roots could take hold. The strength of this partnership lay in its adaptability. Lichens could pause their lives almost entirely when conditions turned harsh, surviving months or even years without significant growth. In the stillness of drought or the darkness of winter, their metabolism slowed to a whisper, conserving the energy needed to endure. Then, when rain fell or snow melted, they would awaken almost instantly, the fungal body swelling with moisture, the algae or cyanobacteria within resuming their sunlit work. This ability allowed lichens to thrive in some of the most extreme environments on Earth, places where other life could not even begin. They were found in deserts where rain might fall only once a year, in polar regions where temperatures rarely rose above freezing, and on windswept alpine ridges where the thin air held little warmth. Beneath their quiet persistence was a chemistry of subtle but profound influence. The acids produced by the fungal partner slowly etched into rock, freeing minerals such as calcium, potassium and magnesium. These minerals, once bound in stone, became part of the first primitive soils, ready to nourish mosses, ferns, and eventually more complex plants. The organic matter left behind when lichens died added structure to the soil, allowing it to hold water and resist erosion. Over millions of years, these processes accumulated into something remarkable. Entire landscapes softened by the patient work of organisms no larger than a coin. In this way, lichens were not just survivors but engineers, preparing the earth for the lush diversity it would one day hold. The presence of lichens also began to influence the climate in subtle ways. By covering vast stretches of rock, they changed the reflectivity of the land, absorbing more sunlight and slightly warming their surroundings. In the smallest of increments, this could affect patterns of snowmelt, the timing of plant growth, and even the stability of certain ecosystems. They were too small to reshape the world overnight, but over the slow breathing of geological time, their collective influence was significant. This is the quiet power of life in its smallest forms, to work so gently, yet so persistently, that the entire planet bends toward new possibilities. Wherever lichens thrived, they became part of the food web. Tiny invertebrates grazed on their surfaces, finding nourishment in the sugars produced by the algae and the proteins stored in the fungal cells. Some animals used them as nesting material, while others relied on them as a source of water in dry times. In polar regions, reindeer and caribou would one day depend heavily on certain lichen species to survive the long winters, scraping through snow to uncover the slow-growing mats beneath. In this way, lichens bridged the gap between the lifeless and the living, turning bare rock into something that could feed and shelter life. Their adaptability even extended beyond Earth's boundaries. In recent experiments, certain lichens have survived the vacuum of space, enduring extremes of radiation and temperature that would kill most life forms. These modern discoveries offer a glimpse into how resilient and ancient this partnership truly is. It is not hard to imagine that if the earliest lichens could speak, they would tell a story of watching continents shift, of enduring ice ages and warm seas, of thriving through volcanic winters and meteor impacts. They have been present for so much of Earth's history that the rise and fall of mountains is simply part of the scenery to them, and still, their essential nature has not changed. Two life forms bound together in mutual benefit, each giving what the other cannot make for itself. It is a reminder that some of the most successful strategies in nature are not built on strength or speed, but on cooperation. In the vast story of life, lichens are proof that unity can outlast even the harshest conditions, that persistence can shape worlds, and that beauty can take the form of a quiet patch of colour clinging to a stone, patiently waiting for the right moment to grow again. If we follow the story of lichens toward its quiet conclusion, we find not an ending, but a continuation that folds seamlessly into the broader history of life on land. Over millions of years, as plants began to spread across the continents and forests rose in green waves, lichens remained where they had always been, at the edges, in the cracks, on the stones and cliffs and high plateaus where roots could not grip. They were no longer the only pioneers, but they were still among the first to arrive wherever bare rock was exposed. After landslides, volcanic eruptions, or the retreat of glaciers, lichens would appear before almost anything else, tracing the outlines of the future in their slow, patient growth. They were the bridge between what was barren and what could bloom, the quiet first chapter in the long narrative of every ecosystem that followed. Even as the world around them became more crowded with life, lichens found their niches untouched by competition. They occupied surfaces too harsh for most plants, endured conditions that would wither leaves and kill roots, and grew so slowly that their needs never strained the resources around them. This ability to exist alongside the busier, faster forms of life meant they could persist in peace, largely ignored by the changes sweeping across the planet. In icy deserts and scorching highlands, they were still there, doing the same work they had done since their origins, breaking down stone, creating soil, and providing a foothold for life to come. Their persistence is why some lichen colonies alive today are thousands of years old, older than most of the landscapes they inhabit. In many ways, their endurance is a lesson written into the very fabric of the earth. Lichens do not demand, they adapt. They do not conquer, they collaborate. They do not rush, they wait for the moments when the conditions turn in their favour, then quietly make the most of them. This is a form of resilience often overlooked in a world that values speed and dominance, but it is one that has allowed lichens to survive planetary changes that have erased entire lineages of other life. Ice ages, shifting continents, mass extinctions, all have passed, and still, lichens cling to stone, breathing in sunlight and moisture, breathing out the slow transformation of the land. Their influence reaches further than the ground beneath our feet. In modern times, scientists study lichens to learn about air quality, for these delicate partnerships are among the first to suffer in polluted environments. Their health becomes a measure of the air's purity, making them living indicators of the planet's well-being. Some species produce compounds with medicinal properties, hints of chemical strategies evolved over eons in the struggle to survive in exposed and hostile environments. Others continue to feed animals in some of the world's most barren regions, carrying forward the ancient role of sustaining life in places where little else can. And yet, despite their importance, lichens remain easy to overlook. Most of us pass them by without a second glance, seeing only a patch of colour on stone or bark. But if we pause, if we truly look, we can see in their quiet presence the echo of the earliest days of life on land. Each patch of lichen is a living fragment of prehistory, a reminder of the time when the continents were bare and life was learning how to climb from water to rock. They are the descendants of that improbable union between fungus and algae, a union that still holds today, unchanged in its essence, unchanged in its purpose. In the grand sweep of Earth's history, the story of lichens is not one of triumph or defeat, but of constancy. They have been with us since before there were forests, before there were animals that walked on land, before the air was filled with birdsong. They will likely be here long after the landscapes we know have shifted into something new. And perhaps that is their greatest legacy, to remind us that the earth is shaped as much by the slow, quiet work of the unnoticed as it is by the great and visible forces. The first lichens were not mighty in size or speed, but they were mighty in patience, and that patience has given them a place in nearly every corner of the world. To touch them now is to lay a hand on a living thread that stretches back through deep time, to a moment when two worlds of life met on bare stone and decided to grow together, forever changing the face of the land. There was a time deep in the ancient history of our planet when the air was still learning its balance, when oceans and skies were rich with invisible life, but the land had only just begun to hold forests. In that age, fungi were not just silent recyclers in the shadows, they were companions to some of the most remarkable organisms to ever walk the earth, the giant herbivores of the Carboniferous and Permian periods. The land was lush with towering ferns, colossal horsetails, and the first seed-bearing plants. Vast swamps spread under a humid sky, and in these fertile wetlands, fungi wove themselves into every corner of the ecosystem. They were not yet the partners of flowering plants, for flowers had not yet bloomed. Instead, they lived alongside ancient trees with bark like armour, and in the roots of spore-producing plants whose forms seemed almost alien. Their role was vital, to break down the dense, fibrous remains of these early giants, to return their stored nutrients to the soil, and to ensure that the circle of life could continue in a world still experimenting with complexity. The plants of that time had a different chemistry than those we know today. Their tissues were rich in lignin, a tough woody polymer that resists decay. For millions of years, lignin was a fortress against decomposition, and fallen trunks could lie for centuries before breaking down. This meant that the first fungi capable of digesting lignin, the ancestors of modern white rot fungi, changed the game entirely. They carried enzymes like keys, able to unlock the chemical bonds in lignin and release the carbon within back into the cycle of life. Before them, much of that carbon was trapped, accumulating in thick layers that would, over eons, become the coal we mine today. The arrival of lignin-decaying fungi was a quiet revolution, altering not only the structure of forests but also the very atmosphere, for it reduced the vast stores of undecomposed plant matter that had kept oxygen levels unusually high. In the damp, dim light of those primeval swamps, fungal fruiting bodies would have emerged from fallen logs, their caps slick with moisture, their gills hidden in shadow. Some clung to the bases of living trees, drawing sustenance from the slow decline of their hosts. Others formed vast mats in the soil, twining among roots, exchanging minerals for the sugars made in leaves far above. The forest floor was a dense tapestry of life, crawling arthropods, shimmering dragonflies with wings as wide as a child's arm, amphibians the size of crocodiles, and beneath it all, fungi moved unseen, their mycelial threads binding the ecosystem together. Without them, the endless chain of leaves and wood would have buried the land, locking away the very nutrients that fueled growth. It was a time of abundance, but also of balance maintained by delicate threads. When a giant tree fern fell, fungi would be among the first to arrive, sending their hyphae into the damp wood, softening it from within. Over months or years, the log would crumble into dark soil, rich with the minerals needed for the next generation of plants. This process fed not only the plants, but the entire web of life. The herbivores who grazed on the lush undergrowth, the predators who hunted them, and the countless small creatures who found shelter in the softened wood. In this way, fungi were not just recyclers, they were providers, sustaining the abundance that made those ancient swamps so rich. Above the ground, the world was filled with slow movement, leaves unfolding, water dripping from branch to branch, the steady hum of insect wings. But beneath the ground, the fungal networks were always busy. They stretched for meters, even kilometers, connecting plants in ways invisible to the creatures above. Through these networks, nutrients flowed from places of plenty to places of need, and chemical signals warned of drought, disease, or damage. Even then, before flowering plants and the vast diversity of modern forests, fungi had begun the work they still do today, creating a hidden economy of exchange, a quiet system of cooperation that allowed the whole forest to thrive as one. And in the heart of this system there was no hierarchy, no desire for dominance. The fungi did not seek to tower above the ferns or the great horsetails, They sought only to endure, to continue their role as mediators between life and death. In the slow breathing of the swamp, in the soft decay of fallen giants, they wrote their signature into the history of the planet, a signature we can still trace in the forests of today, where every leaf that falls, every root that grows, and every tree that stands is, in some way, touched by their quiet, patient work. As the carboniferous swamps deepened and spread, fungi flourished in ways that even the vast green canopies above could not match. The atmosphere of the time was thick with oxygen, far richer than today, and this abundance allowed life forms to grow to sizes now unimaginable. Giant dragonflies skimmed over the water, with wings wider than a human's arm span. Millipedes longer than a man could stand stretched their many legs over the mossy ground, and amphibians the size of crocodiles lurked at the edges of still pools. Yet for all their size and presence, these creatures depended on the smallest of workers, the fungal webs hidden beneath their feet, to keep their world supplied with food and shelter. The trees and plants grew tall and fell often, their trunks dense with lignin, a substance almost immune to decay before certain fungi evolved the tools to unlock it. Without these enzymes, fallen wood would have simply piled higher with each passing century, sealing away nutrients and locking the land into a slow suffocation under its own abundance. When lignin-decaying fungi emerged, they altered the entire balance of the world. These fungi carried molecular machinery so precise and so relentless that they could dismantle the walls of even the hardest plant tissues. In doing so, they broke open a vault of stored carbon and minerals, releasing them back into circulation. The great swamps became living systems that could renew themselves, where death fed life and life prepared for death in a perfect loop. The air itself began to change as the slow release of carbon moderated the high oxygen levels, nudging the climate towards something more stable. It's a shift that unfolded over millions of years, but without it, the Earth might have remained locked in an ecological stasis, green yet stagnant. In the soft shadows of the swamp, the fungi worked without pause. Mycelial threads slipped into fallen trunks, infiltrating the dense wood with patience and precision. From the outside, the logs looked intact for months, even years. But inside, the architecture of their fibres was being quietly dismantled. The once solid wood became soft and sponge-like, then crumbly, until at last it fell apart in the hands of the smallest scavengers. Insects bored tunnels through the softened remains, carrying pieces away to feed their young. Amphibians dug into the moist, decaying logs to lay eggs in the shelter of the fungal work. Even the great trees standing nearby benefited, their roots tapping into the nutrient-rich soil left behind. The partnership between plants and fungi deepened in these ancient forests. Underground, fungal threads fused with plant roots, creating the earliest examples of what we now call mycorrhizal relationships. Through this union, plants gained the ability to draw minerals from the soil more efficiently, while the fungi received a steady supply of sugars created through photosynthesis. This arrangement allowed plants to grow taller and faster, to spread their canopies wider, and to capture more sunlight. In return, the fungi extended their reach deeper into the earth, finding nutrients far beyond the reach of roots alone. Together, they created a cycle of mutual benefit that anchored the entire swamp ecosystem. In the rich air and humid warmth, the diversity of fungi expanded. Some specialized in breaking down fallen leaves, others in recycling animal remains, and still others in extracting nutrients from living hosts. The forest floor became a mosaic of decomposition, each patch at a different stage of renewal. Here a fresh fall of leaves still glistened with rain. There a log had already collapsed into dark, fertile soil. The work was constant but unhurried, for fungi measure time not in days or seasons, but in the steady progress of transformation. Whether working on a fallen branch or a tree trunk as thick as a house, they followed the same patient rhythm: dissolve, absorb, and return. Even in this time of abundance, life was not without its dangers. Floods could drown the swamps, storms could topple entire stands of trees, and shifts in the climate could alter rainfall for centuries. Yet fungi, unlike many of the towering plants and large animals, were ready for such changes. Spores could remain dormant until conditions improved, and mycelial networks could survive underground long after the surface appeared barren. This resilience allowed them to endure disasters that reshaped the visible forest. When the waters receded or the skies cleared, they would resume their work as though nothing had happened, continuing the cycle that kept the ecosystem alive. Their role was not one of conquest or competition, but of quiet necessity. Without them, the wealth of the forest would have been locked away, inaccessible to the next generation of life. They were the silent negotiators between growth and decay, ensuring that nothing was wasted, that every death carried within it the seeds of new beginnings. And though the swamps and forests of that age would one day vanish, replaced by new landscapes and new species, the principles of their work, patience, persistence, and balance, would remain woven into the living fabric of the earth. The great swamps of the Carboniferous began their slow transformation as the ages turned, and with them the role of fungi shifted subtly but profoundly. What had once been a world dominated by towering lycophytes, giant horsetails, and tree ferns gradually gave way to new plant forms better suited to the evolving climate. The air grew drier in some regions, the seasons more pronounced, and vast wetlands retreated. Forests no longer stood as endless cathedrals of green beneath a canopy of constant humidity. Instead, patches of woodland alternated with open ground, and new kinds of plants began to emerge, bearing seeds instead of spores. Through all of this, fungi remained, adapting to each change without complaint, threading themselves into the roots of these newcomers just as they had with their predecessors. As the lignin-rich giants of the Carboniferous declined, the specialized fungi that had once feasted on their massive fallen trunks found new roles. They adapted to a greater variety of plant matter, breaking down smaller branches, leaves, and the remains of seed-bearing plants. In the process, they helped shape the soils of the Permian world, making them richer and more varied. These soils in turn supported the spread of plants into new territories, beyond the edges of the old swamps. Fungi were now partners not only to the towering relics of an earlier age, but also to the pioneers of the new, conifers, cycads, and other early seed plants that could thrive in drier conditions. This adaptability was their strength. Where plants had to evolve new structures and strategies to survive in changing climates, fungi simply adjusted their partnerships. They did not need leaves or seeds. They needed only a surface to grow on, moisture to drink, and organic matter to feed upon. Spores drifted into new habitats, landing in cracks in stone, in the thin soils of upland regions, in the shade of rocky outcrops. Wherever they found a foothold, they began their work, breaking down the old to prepare the way for the new. They were, as always, the first responders to decay, the keepers of the cycle, the invisible scaffolding beneath every living system. Even as the climate shifted toward harsher extremes near the end of the Permian, fungi endured in forms both great and small. In times of abundance, their fruiting bodies appeared in profusion, scattering spores across wide distances. In leaner times, they retreated underground, preserving their strength in the shelter of soil, wood, and stone. Some even thrived in the wake of devastation, when mass die-offs left the land strewn with the remains of plants and animals. In these moments, they expanded rapidly, decomposing the dead and releasing their nutrients into the ecosystem, laying the groundwork for whatever life would follow. This pattern, to step forward when others fell away, would repeat across countless ages of Earth's history. The Carboniferous and Permian fungi left behind more than just fertile soils. They left a legacy of possibility. The enzyme systems they developed to break down lignin still exist in many modern species, a genetic inheritance that allows today's fungi to decompose everything from forest timber to fallen leaves. The networks they formed with ancient roots evolved into the complex mycorrhizal systems that now connect entire forests. The principles of their partnerships, mutual exchange, resilience, and patience remain unchanged even as the partners themselves have shifted over hundreds of millions of years. If we could stand at the edge of a Carboniferous swamp and then walk forward in time to a Permian hillside, we would see entirely different landscapes. Yet in both, we would find fungi quietly binding the system together. In the swamp, they would be softening the massive trunks of tree ferns into dark, fertile loam. On the hillside, they would be threading through the roots of seed plants, drawing minerals from the soil and delivering them in exchange for sugars. The actors above ground would have changed, but the quiet workers below would be the same, carrying forward a role that is both ancient and eternal. Today, when we look at a rotting log in a forest or the fine white threads beneath a layer of leaf litter, we are seeing a living echo of that ancient past. The fungi that helped recycle the giants of the Carboniferous and sustain the pioneers of the Permian are the ancestors of those we know now. Their story is not locked away in fossils or forgotten in the depths of time. It is under our feet, in every breath of forest air, in every handful of soil. And if we listen closely, not with ears but with the patient attention they deserve, we might hear the faint, unbroken thread of their work stretching across eons, reminding us that the health of the world has always rested, in part in the hands of those who dwell in the quiet places, unseen but essential. Long before humanity would study spores under microscopes or cultivate mushrooms for food, fungi were already engaged in an extraordinary partnership, one that would shape the health and survival of entire ecosystems. This was the age when mycorrhizal relationships became a cornerstone of life on land, a quiet alliance between fungi and plants that has endured for hundreds of millions of years. In this ancient world, plants were expanding across new landscapes, sending roots into soils that were still young, still thin, still in need of careful nurturing. Alone, those roots could reach only so far, and the minerals they needed often lay beyond their grasp. But beneath the surface, fungi spread vast, delicate webs of hyphae that could explore the soil in ways roots could not. When these networks touched the roots, something remarkable happened. An exchange began, silent and invisible, but as vital as the breath between leaves and sky. The fungi offered minerals, phosphorus, nitrogen, and trace elements drawn from grains of soil, from the slow dissolution of rock from places roots could never reach. In return, the plants shared sugars made in their leaves, energy captured from sunlight and carried downward through their stems. It was not charity, but a fair and ancient trade, each partner giving what the other could not make for itself. This partnership turned scattered plants into thriving forests, linking them together through underground highways of connection. Through the fungal threads, nutrients could move from one plant to another, balancing the needs of the ecosystem. A shaded sapling might receive sugars from a sunlit neighbour. A plant growing in poor soil might be fed minerals gathered far away. In this way, the forest was not just a collection of individuals, but a community knit together by fungal hands. It is easy to imagine this system as purely mechanical, nutrients in, sugars out, but the reality was far more intricate. The fungi and plants communicated through chemical signals, adjusting their exchanges in response to changing conditions. If the soil grew rich in one mineral, the fungi could offer less of it and focus on another. If a plant was attacked by pests, warning signals could travel through the fungal network, triggering defensive changes in distant neighbours. This was not intelligence in the way we understand it, but it was a form of shared awareness, a responsiveness to the needs of the whole. Even in those earliest days, the mycorrhizal web was more than a supply line. It was a living network of cooperation. The benefits of this alliance rippled outward. Healthier plants meant denser vegetation, which in turn meant more food and shelter for animals. As roots and fungi enriched the soil, it became a cradle for countless microorganisms, each contributing in its own way to the balance of the system. Over time, the underground partnership shaped not only the life above them, but the very soil itself, creating deeper, richer layers that could support more complex ecosystems. The land became more stable, less prone to erosion, more capable of holding water through dry seasons. Every tree, every fern, every flowering plant that followed owed part of its success to these fungal threads. To walk through one of those ancient forests would be to see only half the truth. Above ground, you might see the towering trunks, the canopy of leaves, the slow sway of branches in the wind. But beneath the surface, a hidden forest mirrored the one above, a forest of hyphae, branching and reconnecting, exploring and exchanging, constantly at work. The scale of it would be staggering. Kilometers of fungal thread in a single handful of soil, each strand thinner than a hair, yet strong enough to carry the lifeblood of the forest. Without it, the green abundance above would wither, and the land would fall silent again. This partnership was not without its limits. There were always costs, always choices to be made. A plant under stress might withhold sugars to protect itself. A fungus might divert its resources to a more generous partner. Yet even with these fluctuations, the overall balance held, for the needs of one were bound to the needs of the other. In times of abundance, the web flourished, expanding into new territory. In times of scarcity, it contracted, retreating into the most vital connections until conditions improved. This adaptability ensured that the partnership could survive the shifting climates and changing landscapes of the ages. And so, across millions of years, the mycorrhizal bond endured, quietly writing the foundation for every thriving ecosystem that would follow. As time moved forward through the slow turning of ages, the partnership between plants and fungi deepened into one of the most influential forces in Earth's history. This mycorrhizal bond, invisible to all but the smallest eyes, began to shape landscapes on a continental scale. Wherever plants ventured, fungi went with them, extending their reach far beyond what roots alone could claim. Together, they conquered the slopes of new mountains, the edges of rivers freshly carved by glaciers, and the volcanic islands that rose from the sea. The fungal hyphae could enter soil that was barely more than powdered rock, extracting minerals locked in its grains, while the plants anchored the ground with roots and fed the fungi with sugars from the sunlight above. Each step forward for one was a step forward for the other. In wetter climates, the underground networks thickened into vast webs that connected entire forests. Nutrients could travel between distant trees, weaving the separate trunks into a living fabric. It is thought that in some cases, older, larger plants acted as reservoirs, sending sugars through the fungal threads to feed younger seedlings that struggled in the shade. This generosity, mediated by the fungi, allowed more plants to survive long enough to grow tall and join the canopy. In drier lands, the fungi played a different role, storing water in their hyphae and passing it to their plant partners when the soil grew parched. In both cases, the principle was the same. Connection brought stability, and stability allowed life to flourish in greater diversity. The chemistry of the mycorrhizal exchange was as intricate as any symphony. Fungal enzymes broke down complex minerals into forms plants could use, such as phosphates and nitrates. In turn, the plants delivered glucose and other carbohydrates, fueling the fungi's endless exploration of the soil. This trade was not fixed, it shifted with the seasons, the weather, and the needs of the partners. In times of scarcity, plants might send more sugars to their fungal partners, ensuring the network's survival, knowing that the network would repay them when conditions improved. In times of plenty, the fungi might flood their hosts with minerals, allowing them to grow faster and compete for sunlight. Every exchange was an act of balance, of quiet negotiation conducted in molecules rather than words. Through these exchanges, entire ecosystems became more than the sum of their parts. A forest with a healthy mycorrhizal network was more resilient to disease, more capable of withstanding drought, and better able to recover from storms. Plants that might have perished alone could endure when connected to the web. The fungal network acted as a kind of immune system for the land, detecting and responding to changes with a speed that no single plant could match. This resilience was tested many times as climates shifted, ice advanced and retreated, and new species of plants and animals appeared. Each time the fungal threads adapted, altering their partnerships to fit the needs of the moment. In some places, these networks grew so old and vast that they became living archives of the land's history. They carried the chemical signatures of past seasons, the memory of droughts and floods, the echoes of long-vanished plants that had once been part of their web. When a new seed took root, it was not starting from nothing, it was stepping into an ancient conversation that had been going on beneath the soil for millennia. The young plant's roots would be touched by fungal hyphae, and in that touch, it would be welcomed into the network, becoming part of the community's shared flow of life. This deep interconnectedness blurred the boundaries between individual organisms. A tree was no longer just a tree, it was a node in a vast network that spanned the forest, a participant in exchanges that reached far beyond its own roots. A patch of grass on a hillside was linked to others through the same hidden web, sharing resources unseen by the grazing animals above. Even plants separated by meters or more of open space could be bound together underground by a mycorrhizal thread, their fates tied in ways invisible to the casual observer. It was a reminder that life's greatest strength often lies not in isolation, but in connection. A truth written into the soil by the tireless work of fungi and their silent, enduring bonds. The endurance of the mycorrhizal bond across hundreds of millions of years is a testament to its quiet perfection. Even as continents drifted, climates shifted, and entire lineages of plants and animals rose and fell, the relationship between fungi and roots persisted with only subtle refinements. This was because it was never a rigid arrangement, but a flexible partnership capable of adjusting to almost any change the earth offered. In cold, thin soils near the edges of ancient glaciers, the fungi slowed their metabolism, holding on to nutrients until warmth returned. In tropical forests where competition for light was fierce, they favoured plants that could feed them more sugars, ensuring their own survival while indirectly shaping the composition of the canopy. Everywhere they existed, they acted as unseen architects, influencing not only the health of the individual plants but the very structure of the landscapes. In some ecosystems, the fungal networks reached extraordinary scales, binding together hundreds of species in vast underground communities. Trees of different kinds could be linked through the same mycelial web, their roots touching the same fungal threads. In these shared networks, the success of one plant could ripple out to others. A tree in sunlight might send excess sugars to its shaded neighbours. A plant in mineral-rich soil could share its surplus with others growing in poorer ground. This quiet redistribution softened the edges of competition, allowing more species to coexist. The fungi themselves benefited from this balance, for a diverse plant community provided them with a stable and varied supply of food. Over time, these relationships became deeply embedded in the evolution of plants. Many species grew so dependent on their fungal partners that they could no longer survive without them. Seeds of certain orchids, for example, were so small and lacking in stored nutrients that they could only germinate if colonized by specific fungi. In return, those fungi gained access to a reliable source of sugars once the orchid matured. Such dependencies were not weaknesses, but adaptations, a recognition by nature that survival could be strengthened through alliance. These bonds were written into the genetic memory of both partners, passed down through countless generations. The presence of mycorrhizal fungi also influenced how plants spread into new environments. When seeds travelled to fresh ground, they often succeeded only if fungal spores were present to meet them. In some cases, plants brought their fungal partners with them, spores clinging to roots or soil carried by wind, water, or animals. In others, the seeds found and joined existing fungal networks, merging into the established flow of resources beneath the surface. This ability to integrate into new communities helped plants colonize lands from mountaintops to coastal plains, ensuring that the mycorrhizal web stretched across nearly every terrestrial habitat on Earth. Even in times of great upheaval, when volcanic eruptions cloaked the sky or ice sheets ground over the continents, fungi and plants found ways to preserve their connection. Spores could survive dormant for decades, waiting in the soil until the air cleared and the sun returned. Root fragments carrying living hyphae could be sheltered beneath snow or buried in sediment, ready to grow again when conditions allowed. These strategies meant that when life returned to devastated landscapes, it often began with the reawakening of the mycorrhizal bond. From that hidden starting point, the rebuilding of entire ecosystems could begin. Today, when we walk through a forest or across a meadow, the legacy of this ancient alliance is under every step. The trees above, the grasses swaying in the wind, the wildflowers brightening the ground, all are tied together by the same kind of underground threads that once linked the earliest plants to their fungal partners. The connection is not just a feature of nature, it is one of its foundations. Without it, the green world as we know it would not exist. The first fungi to wrap their hyphae around a root began a story that has never ended. A story of cooperation and reciprocity that still shapes the planet in silence. If we could strip away the soil and see the glowing lines of those networks beneath, we would understand that we are walking not on separate plants, but on the living fabric of an ancient and unbroken relationship, one that continues to hold the earth together